Well, I think he's one of the big figures of the 1980s of Thatcherism, really, with Mrs Thatcher herself, Geoffrey Howe and Michael Heseltine. He was the brains, if you like, who put in the economic structure behind Thatcherism. His big thing, you know, one of the most dramatic moments till Kwasi Kwarteng's kamikaze budget was his budget, where he dramatically reduced the top rate of tax to 40%. And in the process, and this has become sort of part of Tory myth ever since, actually brought in more money from taxpayers than the higher rate, which had been as high as 80% at one stage. So that was a dramatic move. He liked to say that every budget he removed a tax from the statute book. And he then went on, really, to build Thatcherism with the big bang in the city, freeing up banks and investment organisations, encouraging privatisation. So he was a big architect of Thatcherism, although, ironically, he was probably also the figure who rung the bell for the end of Thatcherism when he resigned in 1989 because Mrs Thatcher was no longer taking advice from her ministers but had her own advisor, Sir Alan Walters, and a year later she was gone. But he was a mischievous character as well.
I was going to ask you, tell me about him personally. I mean, we know he had two famous kids.
Yeah, well, he had a number of famous children. Of course, Nigella Lawson, the cook, and also Dominic Lawson, who edited The Spectator and The Sunday Telegraph, now writes for The Sunday Times. In all, I think he had 6 kids. One of them, Thomasina, died young of cancer. And he was, of course, we got used to it now, kids in Downing Street. But when he was in number 11 Downing Street with his second wife, Therese, he had 2 young kids, one of whom is now a school headmaster, but
yes,
that was back then. So
massive weight loss.
Yeah, he also had a diet book. He lost a lot of weight when he left office. His 2 books, actually, his diet book was a bestseller, but so, strangely enough, were his Downing Street memoirs, Inside Number 11, which are a kind of primer for anyone interested in the business of how government works, and have been very popular ever since. But, you know, he was a mischievous character because, having fallen out with Mrs Thatcher because he was a pro-European, in his retirement, he then became probably the most respectable voice for Brexit, making the economic case for that. He also took on the idea of climate change, not because he disagreed with climate change, but because he thought that the economic cost of dealing with it was not worth it. That was his big argument there. But, I mean, last time I saw him a few years ago, I couldn't believe it. He was wearing a stagecoach cloak, you know, those things with layers and layers and layers. And I said to him, you know, it's a very impressive cloak. And he said, yeah, I've always wanted one of these. And I went round to all the London tailors to try and find one who would make one for me. None of them would. So in the end, he'd gone to a Hollywood costumier to have this great coat.
Amazing. Did he make much impression in the House of Lords?
He, more, I think, not within the House of Lords, more as a commentator on economic affairs. He worked for a branch of Barclays after he left office, and his influence, I think, was felt internationally. In a sense, the House of Lords itself was probably a bit too small an arena for him. But he was an interesting guy because he had this sort of reputation all along as being a great economist, and he was intimidatingly intelligent. But I remember saying to him, interviewing him here actually in this studio, and saying, well, you're an economist. He said, no, I'm not an economist, I'm a journalist, which is very interesting.
He was, of course,
right to the
wasn't
end.
He? Yeah. Although he was sacked by The Spectator, wasn't he?
Well, he was editor of The Spectator, and then there was
because of the reaction to the Vietnam War.
Yeah, he opposed the Vietnam War, and there was a controversy, although his son went on in his footsteps to be editor of it. And he was, I mean, we know him as Chancellor as this slightly kind of rotund, roly-poly figure. But in his youth, in his 20s, he was a very dashing man about town.
I'm sure. Look at his children. The old guard are all leaving us, Adam, one by one.
Yeah, I mean, well, we've got Heseltine celebrating his 90th birthday. Yeah. Nigel Lawson was 91 when he died. Geoffrey Howe, of course, died some time ago. I think, you know, what's interesting is probably today more people have heard of Nigella Lawson than have heard of Nigel Lawson. Although we should say...
We're getting old, Adam, is what we should say.
Nigel always insisted that it wasn't vanity calling his daughter Nigella. He insisted he was naming her after the rather beautiful flower, Love in the Mist, not after himself.